The treacherous seas are some of nature's deadliest creations. It's no surprise, then, that throughout the history of mankind, there have been a number of devastating maritime disasters, some with far more casualties than the one we'll be talking about today. However, what no other maritime disaster has is the incredible means by which the sailors aboard the Indianapolis perished. It had been about 6 years into the Second World War, with the death toll rising to over 60 million. Yet, Japan was refusing to surrender, even after being given an ultimatum from the United Allies. In a last-ditch effort to drop the war, the United States decided to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The first bomb was going to be dropped on Hiroshima. Codenamed Little Boy, this bomb had been completely tested and was confirmed ready. The next task was to get it across the Pacific for the attack. Without the proper checks, the Indy set off the first leg of its journey to Tendai, where the cargo was successfully delivered to the American Air Force Base on the 26th of July, after traveling for 10 days. After a short stay at Guam, the captain and his crew commenced their journey 2 days later from Guam to Leyte in the Philippines to meet with the remaining Pacific Fleet, preparing for the final push towards Japan. Following another briefing that the route was clear, the captain continued the journey, not knowing that they weren't alone. Just a few days back, a submarine had started following the Indy without the knowledge of the captain. On this submarine was the Japanese Imperial Navy Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. On board with Hashimoto was a full load of torpedoes and 2 kaitens. These torpedoes were underwater kamikazes, which were manned human torpedoes that were to be driven into the enemy ships. Well, shortly after midnight on the 30th of July, 1945, Hashimoto gave the order, and 2 out of the 6 torpedoes were fired. As soon as the first torpedo hit the Indy, there were flashes of some bright red flame as columns of water rose from the turret, and almost immediately, from alongside the second turret, rose another column of water covering the entire ship. In about 12 minutes, the journey to the Philippines was cut short, and the Indianapolis sank. As the ship went down into the Pacific, about 300 crew died immediately, leaving only 900 men out of the 1,197 men that were on board. Among these survivors of this tragic accident was Captain Charles B. McVeigh III. Right before the ship went completely down into the Pacific, an SOS was sent out in hopes of an immediate rescue. But, unfortunately, it never went through because of the explosion destroying the radio relay system, as well as the power generator. Soon, the ocean was filled with bodies of dead sailors, while those that survived only had their life jackets and rafts to hold on to in the vast emptiness of the open sea. Hours turned into days, and many of those who remained became delirious. Some started hallucinating, hearing voices, and even started suffering from psychosis. They swam away and came back telling the group that the ship never sank and they had just eaten to their fullest. This was before they eventually died. As the sailors continued to perish one after another, those who were alive, thinking that they were going to make it, had no idea that they were in for the worst fate of all. The smell of human vomit, urine, and blood of the injured soon filled the sea, and the sharks smelt that from miles away. They came in their hundreds and began tormenting the sailors. First, they started with the ones that were already dead. One after another, they pulled the dead bodies that were afloat underwater, leaving no trace. But by the second day, the attention of the sharks was drawn to the living as they struggled in the water. This motion was felt by sharks from hundreds of miles away through the receptors on their bodies called lateral lines. And as they drew near to the survivors, they went straight for those that were injured and bleeding. As the torture from these gruesome animals continued, some of the men decided they couldn't bear it. They took deep breaths and they sank into the water below. and they ended their own lives before the sharks could get to them. But this mass of dead bodies only made the sharks more bloodthirsty, so they came back around in search of more man meat. To save themselves from being part of the frenzy, those who were still alive and wanted to be alive had decided to herdle up into groups and intimidate the sharks to drive them away. And in the nighttime, to avoid people swimming away in their sleep, the sailors locked hands together while they slept. This worked, but unfortunately, not everyone could make it into the groups, and those who couldn't get into any of the groups or were on the margin served as shark meals. Those who were huddled up and still alive had to watch as their crewmates were one after another torn apart by the super predators, which later on were believed to be oceanic whitetips, considering how violent the attacks were. All the survivors heard were the screams of their friends and brothers that filled the dark night. And minutes later, when they went down to check on them, all that was left were pieces of the victim's torso swimming across the ocean. To try and save themselves from these attacks, the soldiers discovered that the sharks went after the injured amongst them. So, they did something that we're all familiar with now: quarantine. The surviving sailors stayed far away from those with open wounds, and once any of them died, they immediately offered up their dead bodies as sacrifices to the sharks, in the hopes that the sharks could fill their bellies with the bodies of these dead soldiers, so that the living might be spared. As the attacks on the sailors continued and more men were being killed, the blood-stained waters attracted even more sharks. And so, it continued the vicious cycle of getting eaten alive by bloodthirsty sharks, which only spread more blood, which only brought more sharks. At some point, a particular group made the mistake of opening a can of meat, but before they could take even a single bite, the scent from the can attracted a swarm of sharks straight to them. So to avoid another swarming, they immediately rid themselves of every single portion of meat. Fortunately for those that actually managed to survive, 4 days later, help came, unexpectedly. The survivors were spotted by a passing U.S. naval aircraft on the 2nd of August. The pilot radioed a report of many men in the water, alerting a Catalina PBY flying boat and a close-by destroyer, the USS Cecily Doyle. That night, the PBY Catalina picked up some of the men, and later on, the destroyer came around and rescued the remaining sailors, some of whom were dying from exposure and injury. Out of the 900 men that had survived the crash, only 317 men were still alive when help came. It was believed that these sharks consumed between 25 to 150 men in the space of just 4 days, leaving a mark in history as one of the deadliest shark attacks to have ever occurred. Following the rescue, the people started clamoring for answers, but the U.S. government ceased to make any report of the tragedy until the 15th of August in 1945, when it announced that Japan had finally agreed to surrender. And with the report Captain McVeigh gave about not zigzagging, the Navy knew that they had found a scapegoat. As an inquiry began, the main question that was placed as a priority was why McVeigh didn't zigzag his ship, as that was important to evade submarine attacks. But in the reality of events, it was impossible for McVeigh to achieve that maneuver because he didn't have enough information before the attack. The attack was simply too short to react. And regardless of the fact, McVeigh became the first American officer to be court-martialed and convicted for losing his ship during the war. McVeigh was therefore found guilty of endangering his ship, as he failed to zigzag. Following his guilty charge in February of 1946, McVeigh began getting hate mail from both the general public and the families of the deceased. Filled with immense guilt for the loss of his men, one November day in 1968, Charles B. McVeigh III picked up his service revolver as he sat under a tree and committed suicide. By the year 2000, years after McVeigh had taken his own life, in the bid to clear his name, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution exonerating him. According to the intelligence, enemy submarine activity was, in fact, present along that route, but McVeigh was never given a warning. A year after, the U.S. Navy put in McVeigh's record a memorandum, noting that the resolution had absolved him from blame. But that, however, wasn't going to fix the damage that had already been caused. It's said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and indeed these surviving sailors lived into their 90s, telling the stories of what they had encountered and the injustice that their captain had faced. So, do you think you would have survived such an attack? Do let us know in the comment section down below, and I'll catch you later.